Welcome back to the Takeout. Free speech, social media, political rage, employment decisions, all colliding in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's murder. Will Creeley joins me now. He is the legal director for FIRE. FIRE, that stands for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, an organization that defends free speech. Will, where are we on this?
Oh, we are very busy, Major. Thanks so much for having me. We are living what seems like an inevitable and tragic cycle where the public loses someone, and instead of celebrating their free speech rights, we see this wave of condemnation and backlash to comments that some, many, or most find very offensive, but are nevertheless protected under the First Amendment. We're seeing lawmakers across the country calling for the termination of both government employees who have a First Amendment right to speak as private citizens off the clock. And also, we're seeing calls, even from the Vice President of the United States, to have people call private employers and have folks fired for saying intemperate or impolite or just plain unpopular things about Mr. Kirk.
Now, I have read, Will, and I will turn to you for guidance on this, that people in an employment situation do not have an absolute First Amendment right. That is to say, if the employer for whom they work believes there is reputational harm to a public utterance they make, they can be fired.
That's exactly right, Major. If you work for a private employer, that employer has a great deal of leeway to discipline you for comments that they find unseemly or otherwise at odds with the business's image. That's true. But in our country, where we have a culture of free expression, in addition to a First Amendment right to free expression, we should really think twice about making people choose between having a job and having an opinion. I'm old enough to remember when we saw this exact cycle play out after the tragic death, the murder of George Floyd 5 years ago. We had a lot of hue and cry about cancel culture. Can't we have a situation where people disagree about the meaning of a very public death? And in this country, we should be able to have that disagreement. We should be able to talk about it civilly. One quick point, Major. Mr. Kirk died engaging with folks who didn't share his political opinions. Per the reporting, he was answering questions on immigration and trans rights from folks who disagreed with him. In this country, if we're going to move past the deeply divided nation that we are, we're going to have to talk to each other. And that means not getting people fired because they hold a view that you don't.
I remember, as you do, what you talked about there, George Floyd. There were people who lost their jobs because they pointed out parts of George Floyd's past that were accurate, but that were uncomfortable in the context of his death. I believe things just like that have happened with Charlie Kirk, where people have been either threatened with suspension or firing, or suspended or fired because they pointed out something that Charlie Kirk had said or stood for in the past, separate from the heinous crime that took his life.
That's exactly right. And I'm afraid that's what's getting lost here. You know, children are without a father, a spouse is grieving the loss of her partner. I wish that folks would have kept the emphasis that they had on Wednesday of a man who was more than willing to mix it up with his political opponents in a civil way and not change the subject to trying to get everybody fired because you don't like their viewpoint. That's a disappointment. And I would have to think that Mr. Kirk, given his expressed interest in trading viewpoints instead of just trying to fire folks, he would be disappointed by this response.
Well, this might be a hopelessly naive question, but I wonder, as you study this space, which you do, and you have a consistency on it, which I find admirable, if that people don't understand that a social media post is not a thought that they have just in their head or that they express to a close friend. It is a public expression. Therefore, it is part of a larger system-wide announcement, which makes them more vulnerable to the kind of things we're discussing, whether they should be or not. That's your advocacy point of view. But I wonder if people understand the consequences or the dimensions of what they're doing in social media.
We always tell folks here at Fire, never tweet anything you wouldn't be comfortable seeing on the front page of the New York Times. But that being said, Major, there's an opportunity for all of us here to extend a little grace to our fellow Americans, to understand that tragedy elicits a wide variety of responses. Some of them you're not going to like, but the price for freedom of expression is occasional offense. We don't have to all agree on everything. That's why we have the First Amendment. We can contest what Mr. Kirk's legacy is. We can debate it like Americans. But trying to get people fired or the government leaning on employers to fire people, that's ugly.
Very quickly, Will, does the government have more latitude to fire someone than a private employer over something
If
like this?
if the government employee is speaking pursuant to their official job duties, they don't have much in the way of First Amendment protections. But you do have a right as a government employee to speak as a private citizen off the clock on matters of public concern.
Will Greeley, I appreciate your time and perspective very, very much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.